Here we go, the Cold War. We're finally going to bring this major event to an end. As we know, this was a collection or a series of confrontations that the United States and what was called the USSR had been battling through a series of conflicts, a series of altercations, and a series of wars, if we include the Korean War and the Vietnam War as well. We really start to see this idea that can communism last as far as an economic engine? Can it run the course with capitalism? And for the early stages of what we've seen the Soviet Union do, they have been able to not only spread their ideas and their ideologies and their communist ways across Eastern Europe, but we saw it kind of move into the Asian sphere through China and into North Korea and eventually into Vietnam as well. And the United States did its best with a series of presidents to contain the spread of communism. Ultimately, had some success, but also failed as well. But by the time we get to the 1970s, we kind of see a new approach. We kind of see an approach of peaceful coexistence. This idea that it's going to exist. We cannot exterminate it. All we can do is A, stop it from spreading, or B, contain it in a manner of working alongside or maybe reapproaching our relationship with communist countries. We see this under the Nixon administration, which was known as rapprochement of China. In regards to Nixon actually visits China, and he meets and sits down with Mao Zedong and kind of reopens the door to relations with the United States and China, a communist country. We also see this kind of drives a little bit of a wedge between China's relationship with Russia, because now China's talking to the United States is talking to China, and it kind of wakes up the Soviet Union to, well, maybe they should negotiate, or maybe they should sit down with the United States and talk about what the future looks like amongst communist countries and democratic countries. And then as we move out of Nixon and into the Ford administration, we get a couple packages of what was known as SALT I and SALT II, a limitation treaty of missiles and warheads and vehicles, in a way to kind of tone down the amplified effects of what was known as the arms race, because we basically had about 12,000 nuclear warheads apiece, and at any time we could fire them at each other, but neither side wanted to do that because neither side would exist in the aftermath of a nuclear holocaust. So there was just an attempt to control each other, and the idea of sitting down and signing some limitation treaties not only showed the world that A, both of these nations are, yes, superpowers, but B, they're willing to coexist. They're willing not to destroy each other, but they also are going to hold each other in check with their nuclear capability and their arsenal. But they kind of also let each side know what their arsenal looks like, and they put some limits on it. Moving also up through the 1970s, we finally see the Paris Peace Accords, which brings an end to the Vietnam War. And although it was a failure in the eyes of many Americans and a failure in the eyes of the South Vietnamese, who ultimately fell to the communist North and Ho Chi Minh, it was a relief in the sense of the war is over. It's time to bring troops home. And it's kind of like the final major war type of event of the Cold War era. From this point on, we're not going to see any more wars that break out that we could lump into what we call the Cold War. After the Paris Peace Accord, we really see the Soviet Union begin to struggle economically, feeling in the sense that they've, in their country, reached a peak of their communist economy and their communist ways, and trying to micromanage the entire Soviet satellite nations, and they've exhausted literally their supply of arms as they've spread them across most of Eastern Europe, and also in selling them throughout Asia. And it's finally kind of caught up to them, and they also want to endeavor moving further into the Middle East, much like the United States was doing by the late 1970s. And they want to possibly move into some of that oil supply in the Middle East as well. They had had some friendly leaders in what was known as Afghanistan, and eventually those leaders are removed from rebellious groups in Afghanistan and replaced with more Afghan-supported leaders. The Soviet Union responds with a full-out invasion to topple that government and reinstall a Soviet leadership or a leader who supports Soviet policies. And in that invasion, they exhausted their resources. They spent lots and lots of money to the effect that it was taking a toll on the people inside of Russia. And they kind of got to experience their own civil unrest. They got to experience, as some would say, their Vietnam protests in regards to their invasion of Afghanistan. The people began to call upon the government to stop, to withdraw. Enough is enough. In other words, we need to come home and leave Afghanistan alone. But the Soviet Union continued to fight. In about 10 years, they fought in Afghanistan trying to take that mountainous country that ultimately for them also was a failure as far as the invasion goes, other than they spent a lot of money and exhausted a lot of their treasury. In the United States, we have a president who refers to, by the time we turn into the 1980s, the Soviet Union as the evil empire, basically recognizing that their ways and their ideologies is contrary to the American belief of freedom. And as Ronald Reagan dubs the Soviet Union an evil empire, he's also standing tall in the face of the adversity of the Soviet Union, meaning that he can sense, and his intelligence tells him that they're coming to a breaking point. And if you stand firm and stare them in the face and make them think that you're not by any means faltering like they are, that they might just give in or they might just collapse. Well, the United States had some technology, and Ronald Reagan did a significant job of broadcasting this technology, letting the Russians know, almost like they did with Sputnik, letting us know about their technology. The United States was working on what was called the SDI program, the Strategic Defense Initiative. The idea was that we would put a missile defense system in space, and it would shoot lasers, and these lasers would, any missile that was launched out of the Soviet Union, as it left the atmosphere, before it could break back into the atmosphere, these lasers would pick up these missiles and destroy them in space. Now, that's some fascinating technology, and when it was first introduced, a lot of people laughed and they thought, wow, that's a far-fetched idea, and it kind of sounds like a Star Wars movie. And then they dubbed the program Star Wars. But two things. Number one is it never materialized. It never came to be an actual missile defense system. We were a little ahead of our time. We couldn't develop it in the 1980s. But in return, it scared the Russians so much that they began to try to develop the same type of technology, and once again exhausted more of their money and their resources in this, trying to catch up in this so-called arms race, or in space now, for that matter. So that too kind of plays into the collapse of the Soviet Union as well. What we get is an attempt of communism to infiltrate the Western Hemisphere yet again. We talked about in 1959 it made its way into Cuba. We kind of see it move into parts of Central America and parts of South America as well. Reagan institutes a doctrine, tries to remove communist leaders who embrace communism in the Western Hemisphere, and kind of, takes that banner, symbolic, like previous presidents, to stop the spread of communism in the Western Hemisphere. And that is known as the Reagan Doctrine, specifically in places like Nicaragua, for example. Additionally, the Soviets elect a new liberal leader, and this new liberal leader really represents the emotion and the feel of the Soviet people. They are fed up. They have had enough. And quite frankly, there were multiple rebellions across Eastern Europe, one in Prague, for example, in which citizens rose up and they wanted to break off the rule of communism. They wanted to open up their society beyond just the Soviet control. And this new leader, his name was Mikhail Gorbachev, and Gorbachev was elected to just do that very thing. That's why the people elected him. And what he did was he came up with two programs. His first program was called Perestroika. And this Perestroika enabled throughout the Soviet Union, throughout Soviet states, an openness to begin free enterprise. And this free enterprise brought satisfaction, it brought self-sufficient, it brought ingenuity, it brought a change in the overall economy. And it was felt throughout the empire. Even the Soviet Union itself recognized the effects of implementing some versions of capitalism in a slow manner, but it definitely felt good economically speaking. It brought some relief, and that's what the people wanted. The last one was called Glasnost, and Glasnost is going to kind of begin the process of implementing democratic freedoms and implementing democratic reforms throughout the Soviet Union. So both programs were the first steps in the actual breakdown of the communist Stalin control that dominated this time period. But to kind of put the dagger into kind of where we started with the Iron Curtain, Ronald Reagan visits Berlin and he basically calls out Gorbachev to tear down that wall. Speaking of the Berlin Wall, show the world that there's a new day, there's a new change that's going to happen in the Soviet Union, and the most symbolic way of doing that is to unite Germany again in Berlin, from East Berlin to West Berlin, and tear down that Berlin Wall. And Gorbachev responds, and the Soviet Union shows their willingness, and what we see is the Berlin Wall. By the time we move into George H.W. Bush's administration, the Berlin Wall will come down, thus ending the Cold War.